So once you've got assets and they're suspicious, you have to start looking into their provenance. And that is something you'll all be familiar with. You look at the money flow, you look at other accounts that feed into that account. And the key point, of course, is that you look at how the corrupt person has mingled the legitimate and the illegitimate. And this is something that is very significant, as I discovered when I researched my book on money laundering. As you'll know from fraud investigation, the clever, corrupt individual will mingle. He may have a business, a politician will have a business, and he will mingle the corrupt payments within that business. And therefore he will enable them to get lost. As in the common parlance, the best place to hide a tree is a forest, and the money, corrupt monies, will remain secret. And if the politician or his associate or family member, and you'll be familiar with PEPs, with politically exposed persons, now very much in the banking focus, as we recently heard about Coots, getting a 9 million fine for their failure to implement proper advanced due diligence. If a politician or an associate is a successful business person in his own right, it's very difficult for the investigator. It's a total challenge, in fact, to separate the corrupt money from the money that's been obtained, quotes, in a genuine way. And that is where corruption and money laundering are so closely allied, because politicians, will typically have access to business people. A lot of the money, the corrupt monies that the politician will receive, will indeed come from business people. In my book on money laundering, The Washing Machine, talked about the corrupt practices, which I should say have never in fact been resulted in a conviction, but have been pretty well ascertained, of Asif Ali Zardari, the president of Pakistan, who took a 10% bribe from a man to whom he gave a license for importing gold into Pakistan. Now that money, that 10%, of course, didn't come ever into Pakistan. It went through Switzerland, through a lawyer in Switzerland, into a Swiss bank account into Geneva, and no doubt was subsequently used for buying Zardari's houses around the world. And that did result in allegation, and indeed in a prosecution in Switzerland, which I believe was never completed. I'll turn a little bit to techniques used by politically exposed persons. A lot of corruption stems from, or is based on, overinflated contracts and over-invoicing. You'll be familiar with that from a fraud perspective. The paper trail can look right on the surface, but when you look onto it, the goods may never be shipped. It's just a paper trail to put you off or the police off their scent. To the auditor, it may look okay, but neither side can identify where the goods came from, or in what quantities, or that it was priced at the price as specified on the paper. And of course, politically exposed persons, as I say, will typically want to move money either out of their own country, in other words, from the place where the corrupt money has been obtained to a bank account elsewhere, or indeed the money will have been generated outside their country, and it will be circulated in countries, in foreign jurisdictions. So moving money is very much part of the PEPs, the politically exposed persons, technique, just as typical money launderers have the same process. And then you come back to the investigating job, and the investigating job is the difficult one, of course. It's following the money. It's finding that PEP's money, whether it's gone from Geneva to London through a house, maybe the house was sold, it's gone into a British Virgin Island trust. It's following the money. It's the standard practices, nothing special about it. The PEP may be at the end of the chain. We have PEPs, of course, trying to hide their wealth. Politically exposed persons are not by their nature all corrupt, but when they are, the natural thing, and it's the thing that all money launderers want to do, is hide their wealth. And it's quite interesting now that the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, is in fact making a specific focus now on the beneficial ownership of assets. You'll be familiar, the third directive put the spotlight on PEPs themselves. The fourth directive is going to look at the techniques for hiding and for stripping away the beneficial ownership. More stringent, this is putting emphasis, I believe, and more pressure on banks and on investors and people dealing with the high net worth individuals, really to place stringent checks and to look at how management service companies, for example, may be used to disguise beneficial ownership. And of course, we know that lawyers and accountants, often the best blue-blooded accountants, will be used, and often through jurisdictions which themselves are, blue-blooded, 5-star, whatever you like to call it, London or New York or Tokyo, wherever it is, Frankfurt, to get the imprimatur of quality, of trust and confidentiality. So, those the best fraudsters will always use those jurisdictions, and of course the best PEPs will want to use those jurisdictions. I'm happy to take a question if this gentleman wants. Did you want to ask a question, sir? Because
I'm not very familiar with the UK Bribery Act.
Right.
To know within its scope, what the position of the UK Bribery Act on legal gratuity? Legal gratuity. That is making an offer of appreciation after being legitimately offered a contract to the person giving you the contract. For instance, I'm being given a contract.
Can I interrupt that? Can I make a suggestion that we deal with it at the end, or perhaps I talk to you, because I'm not quite hearing you well, and I'd very much like to talk to you personally, if that's okay.
It's okay.
But it sounded very, and the UK Bribery Act is very much, as you can see, in its infancy, and very exciting for people who are trying to understand the new world of corruption. But perhaps if I might just revert to my address, and I'm quite interested now, and this may relate to your point, how does the politically exposed person get his money out of the country? Now, he might put the payment into an offshore account, which is already out of the country. If he's looted the money from inside the country, of course, he's got to get it external. He's got to move it out of the country. For example, you will be familiar with the case of President Abacha of Nigeria, who used the most gross, really, and very basic, primitive ways to move to steal his money, which basically meant going to the central bank and telling the governor that he'd like however million that day. And then he put the money into Nigerian banks, and they simply moved it abroad. And we're talking many years ago now, banks were a little less perceptive, a little less diligent, shall we say, and that money filtered around Western locations. I mean, Jersey, Switzerland, London were all major beneficiaries. And importantly, that money did eventually, some of it did go back to Nigeria. And I will come to some of the issues of repatriation of corrupt monies in a little while. But the politically exposed person in his country can use very simple methods, simply like putting diamonds, for example, into a diplomatic bag, or smuggling the money out of his country if he's got the power to corrupt customs officials. So there is not a lot of sophistication in how PEPs necessarily move their corrupt monies. Now, if you're a shrewd PEP, of course, you'll put your money into Switzerland, or you might put it into a BVI service company, and that will obtain quite a lot of anonymity. And that's why, indeed, as I said earlier, the FATF is taking such interest in the question of the disguises that places like, or PEPs will use in places like the BVI or elsewhere to to hide their money. There may also be contractual relationships which people can use to create those sorts of structures with overpayment or underpayment of invoices. I should say that, just a little local note if you like, the UK has a number of organisations, investigative police organisations, that deal with corruption. One of them works for the Met, and the other works for the city. And I don't think I'm going to get into how exactly they differ, because it's quite a sort of turf-watching thing. But it's quite important. And basically, the Met deals with the sort of international aspects, and the city deals with the more domestic aspects of corruption, local contracts where the corruption occurs in the UK, whereas I think the Met deals more with corruption in the international non-UK markets, if you like. Let me turn now to some of the warning signs of corruption. How do you know if money that you've got into your bank, into your investment house, whatever, is corrupt? And there's one, we've talked about the sniff test, of course. There's another simple way. If a Nigerian comes along and he's earning £20,000 each year, and he comes along with a payment of £100,000, you might say to yourself, well, it's Nigeria. He's bringing 5 times more than his annual salary. That might well be worth a little look. It's not always a look that, of course, banks will give, as we discovered from the Financial Services FSA last year, Financial Services Authority last year in their report in June. They said 75% of banks did not always manage high-risk customers and pet relationships effectively. And they wanted banks to be a little bit more concerned about the money laundering systems and a little bit less concerned about their reputations. And the FSA also found that a quarter of banks appeared more concerned that a PEP might be involved in a public corruption scandal than that they might be corrupt in laundering those proceeds. So there's a big reputational element when it comes to dealing with corrupt monies. People are very nervous about going to a PEP who may both be legitimate, in which case he's going to be very upset, or if he's illegitimate and he's got friends in high places in the UK, in your bank, for example, he may well be very unhappy if you go to him and say, I'm a little bit worried about this payment, I'm going to put a stop on it. And then he goes to his buddy in number 10, but he goes to his buddy in government and says, this bank is a bit unfriendly, can you do something? And some of you may be familiar, it's a very important case currently going on, I do suggest you may refer to it, about a man called Shah and HSBC, where indeed the bank did stop payment, in fact from a Zimbabwean. The Zimbabwean lost the contract. The bank was subsequently informed by the police that in fact it was an okay payment and the Zimbabwean was okay, but the contract had been lost, and the Zimbabwean says, what was the basis of your suspicion? The key point in spotting corrupt monies, as it is indeed laundering monies, is regular due diligence of cash flows into accounts. Cash flows will change over the period of a business. A businessman is very small when he sets up an account. 10 years later, maybe a Richard Branson and the Virgin, those monies are going to be transformed. And if you don't keep an eye on that due diligence, you are going to be get into embarrassment. Now, I will just turn briefly, because I suspect that my time may be running a little short. How do you spot the corrupt money? And at what stage do you decide that the money is corrupt? Now, it is very helpful if somebody comes from the Nigerian government and says, you know, we have just been looted by X or Y, and that money is we want it back. It's not often that that happens. So the investigator will often have to use inference, and the sort of inference that I've already talked about is the salary that doesn't match with the monies, some sort of mismatch between what was originally set up in the account and what subsequently happened to the account. So the small business that's putting large amounts of money, the small business that says it's based in London and money starts coming from the BVI. There's a whole myriad of things, and they are basically part of the money laundering rule book, and it's something that's very familiar. I will talk very briefly about one or two of the things that law enforcement can do when they decide that there is bad money in a bank, or when there's a suspicion of bad money. One of them is they can restrain the money. They can, in other words, put a stop on that money. Now, there are problems with putting a stop on monies in general. I mentioned the problem with upsetting a PEP, but one of the problems is it's a restraint order is what's called inter partes. In other words, you have to tell the PEP, we're stopping your money. And that is like to cause considerable disturbance. There are tactical issues. Sometimes restraint isn't feasible, for example. Restraint means a court stops an individual from disposing of his assets. You notify the bank that the owner of the account is restrained, and the bank's on notification that they shouldn't shouldn't allow him to move funds, or they should report it if he's asked to do so. Of course, a lot of countries, when they've lost a lot of money, you know, come to Western governments and they say, you know, this politician has been on the make. We suspect there are umpteen billions in your banks. Please, you know, could you stop it? And could you please send them back, by the way? And it just isn't that simple. And this, I think, is something that puts embarrassment in the way of Western law enforcement, because they know to get a restrained order, you have to go through the CPS, and the CPS need to know what are the circumstances of the money, how do you know it's corrupt, you know, if there's been a conviction in the country of origin, you know, what is the status of that court, what is the status of the conviction, how closely was the money identified. It's a far more complex matter than simply saying, you know, we've toppled him, we've looked in the books, that money's in your bank, we want it back. It doesn't work like that. Now, having said that, and generally speaking, the Arab Spring has not, has produced a lot of corrupt allegations, but it hasn't produced much solid evidence of corrupt monies in Western banks. But you may be familiar with the recent law case decision in the UK, referring to the house, a 10 million house in Hampstead, very upmarket area of London, and that the Libyans in fact came to London and they said Saad Gaddafi is no way he could afford on legitimate grounds £10 million to buy this house. We are absolutely adamant this has been bought with the proceeds of crime, and in fact the British government, well, I should say no, the British government, the court decided, in fact, yes, we accept this house is bought with the proceeds of crime. And that house, I believe, has now been returned to the Libyan people. I think that is perhaps a very encouraging note on which I will end, that there is some real movement now to deal with corruption on the part of the courts, on the part of government. I think it's got a long way to go. I think companies and banks have an enormous amount of work to do to improve their anti-corruption systems, but the campaign has started, I think, to make a cleaner system. And thank you very much indeed.